Chapter 5. First Blood.
About 10, maybe a dozen,
Alwen said, rubbing his wrists, which moments before had been imprisoned in the rusty metal chains. Garin fumbled with Dickie's knife in the lock of the cage door.
We need to take half of them out before the rest react or we'll be in serious trouble.
The lock clicked, and the cage door was released from the bolt that held it in place. Garin turned with a triumphant smile. With a faint creak, the metal door opened, allowing us to admire the scenery outside without the obstruction of the cage bars. Freedom. What a great word. How precious it is to those who have been deprived of it, even if only for a few hours. I felt an irresistible urge to leave this stinking, filthy prison. The sight of the open door made the cage feel even smaller than before, increasing my feeling of claustrophobia. However, before we were able to unlock the cage door, Alwen had spent a few minutes poking around the shackles on his hands. After failing a few times, he finally managed to break the first of them. He looked at us with that expression of smug satisfaction that comes to everyone who overcomes a difficult challenge. Quickly, but quietly, he unfastened his bonds and stretched his arms out to their full length, a grin of pleasure on his face. He then set about freeing Garin. It took him much less time to overcome the security of the cage door, but he did not come to release us.
Hey, what about us?
Protested Alex, when he realized they were not going to free us. Alwen turned and motioned for us to be quiet.
This is not going to be fun, boy,
he whispered.
But you'd better stay where you are, and that especially goes for you.
He added gruffly, pointing at Dickie.
We're only going to get one chance at this, so if any of you do anything foolish and wake the orcs before time, pray to your gods that none of us survive. If the orcs don't kill you, I myself will take enormous pleasure in ripping out your innards with my bare hands. Is that clear?
Before anyone could respond, Garin added a few words of advice.
If anything goes wrong, pretend you're still asleep. With any luck, they'll just execute both of us.
Execute? My God, the threat of death seemed ever present in this place.
We'll be back,
Garin assured us as his companion disappeared under the wooden wheels of the wagon.
How do I know you will?
Asked Claudia, approaching the blonde stranger. He looked at her, and then at the others. Our spirits were broken. We had no other choice than to accept whatever help these two strangers would offer us. Garin's blue eyes turned back to Claudia, but this time they were filled with pain and regret, caused by bitter memories and old wounds that would never heal.
I give you my word,
he promised. No sooner had he turned away, a voice of contempt arose from the shadows.
These two give their word too easily.
Dickie muttered, still smarting from his humiliation.
That's the second time I've heard the same shit. I'd like to know what that word is really worth.
Garin turned back to the murky darkness that enveloped Dickie. None of us could make out Dickie's face, but Garin's glowing eyes seemed to see him clearly as if it was broad daylight. At least that was Dickie's impression.
Come on, Garin.
An urgent whisper from Alwen forced his friend to look away from Dickie. Both strangers then moved swiftly and silently away from the steel door. They disappeared into the night as if swallowed by the earth itself.
Let's hope they keep their word.
Hansi sighed as the door closed again, leaving us alone.
They will,
Claudia said with certainty.
I saw it in their eyes.
A pair of glowing eyes scanned the shadows from behind the sturdy wooden wheels that supported the wagon. The campfire was now a shapeless mass of charred wood and grass whose burnt-out remains still smoldered in the night. However, the surrounding area around the camp was illuminated by a ring of torches placed at regular intervals around the perimeter of the camp. It was bright enough to keep any wild beasts from the wilderness at bay, and to reveal the presence of intruders. or escapees. The bodies of the orcs lay motionless on the ground as they grunted and snored in their sleep. Their weapons and armor lay beside them.
Perhaps they'll be like that all night,
whispered Garin.
It is possible,
replied Alwen, his eyes fixed on one of the orcs standing guard on the stone mound.
Let's get to the horses. I think that guard over there is asleep.
Without waiting for an answer, Alwen dashed through the shadows of the night and across the dusty ground towards the animals. Garin, not too pleased with the daring actions of his friend, glanced briefly at the sentry, but had no choice but to follow. He had lost sight of his companion. The blonde managed to reach the horses, apparently unnoticed by anyone. The smell of the animals was very strong. The stars above blanketed the clear night sky.
Olwen, Olwen,
he called in a whisper. He made his way among the animals, sensing that they were beginning to grow restless. They began to snort and move around.
Easy, easy boy, calm down.
He whispered to the horses as he gently patted and stroked them. A hand grabbed him from behind with incredible strength and covered his mouth. For a split second, he was gripped by uncontrollable fear, but he soon recognized his assailant.
Shh, it's me.
A familiar voice whispered from behind him. Soon the grip loosened, and Garin was free.
Now look.
Alwen pointed into the shadows.
1, 2, and 3.
Up to 3 guards were standing at different points around the camp.
Can you see them?
Garin nodded in confirmation.
Now come, I have found our horses.
Have you seen them?
Negative.
Alex was still scanning the camp with his eyes. We all did the same. Only Dickie did not join our search. He kept himself apart from us, indifferent to our concerns. He had no doubts as to what was going to happen.
I don't know where they went,
Alex said to Hansi, without looking away from the area in front of him.
Maybe they're still under the wagon,
suggested Claudia as she moved towards the bars where her friends were standing. Hansi turned his eyes to her.
If they got out, they did it very quickly,
he said. Claudia's spirits sank. Dickie's bitter warning of betrayal seemed to be coming true. The minutes ticked by as everyone fell into an anxious silence.
Do you see anything?
No,
I replied. A pale-skinned hand caressed the carved surface of the bow. He was relieved to feel that intimate touch that had accompanied him for so long. It was still there where he had left it. The orcs had not even bothered to move it. Carefully, he unhooked it from the bow holster that was attached to his saddle. He reached for the quiver resting beside him and knotted it to his thigh. His fingers selected an arrow. It was a small shaft of feathered wood, as lethal as it was accurate. He gazed at its deadly alloy point. Alwen had designed it for him. It was far more aerodynamic and destructive than the traditional ones. Those few ounces of sharp steel would soon bite into the flesh of the enemy. He placed the shaft against the wood of his bow. With his fingers, he carefully knocked an arrow to the bowstring. He took a deep breath to connect with the spirit that slept in the curved wood. He pulled the bowstring taut until the deadly arrow tip caressed the carving on the wood. He aimed the projectile at the rocky outcrop, lining up his first victim along the shaft of the arrow.
Are you ready?
Olwen's voice sounded from among the horses. Shortly after, his face came into view. Garin lowered his weapon before looking at him and nodding his head in agreement. Alwen disappeared among the horses again. The stallion before him was a fine specimen with a long, immaculate mane that was as white as the great glaciers of the Yikta. On his side was attached the long, sharp blade of a sword, sheathed in leather and hide. One by one, Alwen caressed the runes that adorned the ornate surface of the leather that held it, recalling the fleeting memories of days gone by. Strangely, they had come back to him today, even though he would never admit it to anyone. Only one word passed his lips as his right hand gripped the ornate hilt of the sword's deadly steel. He tugged at it, releasing it from its slumber. The blade revealed its naked form, glinting under the malevolent light of the moon that shone silently from above. Just one word, and it was the name of a woman.
Are you sure? Are you sure you don't see anything?
Totally sure.
Odin rolled his eyes to see that Alex was starting to get nervous. Nothing, not a sound, not a glint, not a movement. Nothing. They seemed to have been swallowed by the earth.
They're gone. Poof. Vanished.
Alex looked away. He turned his eyes to the shadows outside, trying to dismiss the idea that we had been tricked.
I told you they wouldn't come back,
came Dick's unmistakable voice. This finally annoyed the young musician.
Oh, shut up, will you?
He snapped.
We're in enough trouble without your help.
Dick smiled smugly, but made no further comment.
They'll come, they'll come,
the cream-haired boy kept repeating to himself. It was more an attempt to convince himself than to inspire confidence in us. Odin shifted his gaze from the darkness outside to the darkness inside the cage. As he did so, he saw the bars of the door sway slightly in the wind. It made him think of an idea that had perhaps been sidelined by Alwen's threat.
What if we try to get out on our own?
He said, forcing most of them to turn their attention to him.
They left the door open.
There was an awkward silence. All eyes were fixed on the half-closed door. For the first time, the possibility of our own escape became tangible.
It could be dangerous. You heard what that guy said. He sounded serious.
Claudia kept the deep darkness of her irises fixed on the night and all the shapes that became vague under its cloak. She searched for that unnoticed movement, that lone sound that would reveal the enigmatic men with flaming pupils. Contrary to what Alex would have us believe, Claudia was not only sure that they would return. She knew, as surely as one knows, that one day we will leave this world, that they were still there, close at hand, and that sooner or later they would reveal themselves. So she didn't pay much attention to the conversation going on behind her, where the rest of us were already looking for an alternative escape route. Her eyes searched persistently, tracing the dark seeds of the night. Then, like the ethereal trail of a ghost, a strange, fleeting glow flickered across her retina, followed by a diffuse movement. The girl's eyes widened, and joy filled her body.
There they are,
She said a little too loudly. Dickie sat up in surprise, as if it was inconceivable for anyone to utter those words.
there they are.
She repeated excitedly, lowering her voice to a whisper, waving us over to her location. We turned to her in surprise, interrupting our conversation. We pressed ourselves against the bars, close to where she was standing. She did not look away from where her eyes were fixed.
Where?
Asked Alexis, who, like us, could see nothing out of the ordinary. Claudia pointed her outstretched finger somewhere in front of her.
There, between the horses and that line of rocks.
Our eyes darted helplessly to that spot without either of us noticing anything remarkable in the darkness. The faded silhouettes of the horses, caressed by the pulsating light of the circle of torches, were barely distinguishable. Even less so the stones, now barely visible in the camp's brightness.
Are you sure? I can't see anything.
I'm sure.
It could have been a reflection.
I saw them, I'm sure.
The night was calm and uneventful. From the high rock where he was stationed, there seemed to be nothing that would endanger the camp. The wild beasts would not come near the light. But you never know. It's always best to be vigilant. The long curved nail of his thumb continued to dig relentlessly between his overgrown yellowish teeth, searching for the nagging scrap of food that just refused to come out. Placing the spear beside him, he picked up a long, rusty knife, which he proceeded to use as a toothpick. Everything seemed so quiet that it bored him to distraction, so much so that he could not stop himself from opening his jaws wide to let out a yawn. When he opened his eyes, a blurred shape surged out of the shadows in front of him. But before he could react, a swishing sound cut through the air, and a steel blade sent his soul into the depths of eternal darkness. A noise? With a start, another orc awoke from the deep sleep that had overcome him during his watch. He felt his body slumped forwards as the support of his spear failed him. A noise! Could it be Luhard's? He fought the urge to doze off again and tried to clear his mind as quickly as possible. Instinctively, he grabbed the shaft of his spear and took a quick look around. On the first pass, he noticed nothing strange. It was only on the second that he noticed, with alarm, that his two companions were missing. They should have been standing guard. He lifted his hulking frame, clad in fur and armor, with his spear at the ready. The night was quiet, but it was unusual for the sentries to leave their posts. Then, he heard a deadly whistling sound rush towards him, making his hair stand on end. He only had time to turn in the direction the sound was coming from, before something sharp stuck his neck and severed his windpipe. Agonizing pain and a choking sensation of suffocation followed. His vision blurred and he felt his muscles lose control. His hands clasped his throat, from which a thin wooden shaft protruded. A warm, viscous liquid flowed through his fingers. It was his own blood. The same blood that was dripping from the sharp inches of steel that were protruding from the back of his neck. The grey feathers of the arrow were the last thing he saw before his body plummeted from the rocky mound. He fell to the ground with a dull thud. A blood-soaked steel blade flashed brightly in the night, reflected by the light of the moon. Green eyes filled with rage gazed out at the sleeping camp. The image brought back memories of bloody days of slaughter, forgotten days when he was the monster from hell. Garin gave him the signal. The nightmare was about to begin.
They have stopped! Finally! It seems they've stopped.
The sounds of battle faded away, dissipating in the wind. We couldn't see anything from within the cage, but we were witnesses to the cruel symphony of sounds that only come with brutal and violent death. The concert of shrieks and screams seemed to go on forever. The orcs squealed like pigs at the hands of their butchers. Their cries of pain and terror still echoed in our minds. The experience was terrifying. We were appalled. We were shocked. Alex turned to us. His eyes were wide with fear and anxiety. His heart was pounding.
I can't hear those things,
he said hopefully.
Does that mean that they're all...
Good God, they've been killed.
Better them than us.
Dickie spat. It was not long before we spotted a figure emerging from among the horses. His golden locks confirmed to us that it was Garin. He was bringing the animals with him, holding all the bridles and pulling them along. We were so absorbed in watching him that we didn't see Alwen appear from behind us.
It's all over now. Sorry for all the noise and shouting,
he said in a warm tone of voice. We all jumped with fright at his unexpected arrival. Dickie nearly died of fright. Alwen's face was covered in thick blackish blood that gave off a pungent smell. He raised his hands to rub his eyes, revealing that the thick viscous liquid had soaked his arms up to his elbows. There were also large splashes of blood on his broad torso. Our hair stood on end as we imagined the brutal carnage that had resulted from the fight. His face didn't look too upset by what he had been forced to do. In fact, he looked surprisingly calm. He looked more like someone who had just come home from a tiring day at work. He waited for Garin to bring the horses closer, deliberately ignoring the barrage of questions that we directed at him. Alwen instructed his companion to tie the horses to the back of the wagon. He added a couple more remarks that we could not make out. Then he turned to us and told us to get some sleep.
"We'll get this rotten piece of junk out of the wastelands,"
he said, slapping the wagon with his hand. Before we could utter a word, he turned and disappeared from sight. However, his unmistakable features soon appeared again through the bars that held us captive.
"This is for you."
His bloodied hand passed us a jingling mass of metal through the bars of the cage. All our eyes were fixed on it for a moment. It was a large iron ring with several huge, heavy keys hanging from it.
"These are the keys to your bonds."
He looked up at us, his eyes gleaming behind the bars. His emerald eyes gazed at Dickie for a moment, not hiding their contempt. Almost immediately they turned back to us.
"In case you decide to make plans of your own."